Am I chairing this session?
Uh, yes,
Okay, very good.
I will.
We've been
Yeah.
swapping a bit, improvising. No problem. I will chair the session. So we are starting. Welcome to panel number two, day number two. We are discussing for the first time Hebrews within Judaism. We have a lovely, beautiful set of participants here. We will begin following the formula we have been following. So we have panelists that are presenters. They have up to 10 minutes each to discuss the three questions. Some people are asking, what are the three questions that I was alluding to in previous sessions? Those questions are on the Enoch Seminar webpage dedicated to this conference. It's included in the chat button. But basically, all of the panelists for all of the panels have been asked to ask the following three questions, which I repeat. Why do you think that text X or Y should or should not be within Judaism? What are the criteria for determining that a text is or is not within Judaism? And what changes when a text is read within Judaism? So those are the three questions for clarification. Now we're going to apply those questions to the letter to the Hebrews. And without further ado, we will allow our first presenter, Madison Pierce, to begin.
Okay. Well, I want to say that it's a bit challenging to think about all the different ways that we could talk about this topic. So I hope that the path that I've trod through, my understanding of Hebrews is remotely helpful. But I look forward to the discussion because I think that will be a really rich experience. It seems to me that Hebrews and the sort of within Judaism, whatever we're calling it these days, is a really important pairing. Hebrews has a really interesting history in terms of its Jewishness or not. And so, just as a sort of preliminary note, I thought it might be helpful for us to consider some of the common assumptions that often come up about Hebrews. These are to varying degrees still prevalent. I find that they're very common in New Testament introductions, very common among sort of lay people and things like that. There are still scholars. I mean, there have been multiple books in the last year that have advocated for something like this. So there's still persistence in scholarship as well. But I do acknowledge that these assumptions are less common among Hebrew scholars today. So the assumptions. One is that the ways have parted, that Judaism and Christianity are distinct, and formally so. One assumption that often comes up in studying Hebrews is this idea that the reason that Hebrews is written is that there's a group that's considering relapsing into Judaism, which that terminology is horrific. And then that the author of Hebrews, in trying to keep them from reverting or, in service of whatever other purpose they have in mind, present the shortcomings of the sacrificial system. And so Judaism or Jewish practices become this sort of almost straw person for what the author is hoping to do. So when I was approaching this topic, I think that I really sort of settled on the second question. How do we determine whether this is a Jewish text or not? And I sort of worked backwards. So starting with these assumptions, I sort of wondered, what are the things that we would look for if we were seeing a text that wasn't Jewish? And so this is the list that I came up with, but I'd be really eager to hear if you if you have others. So my questions were, does the author appear to differentiate between these two groups? Do we have language of, that's insider outsider? Do we have language of Jews and Gentiles? Anything like that? And the answer, from my perspective, is no. The nearest that we get to something like that is the author talks about the seed of Abraham or the descendants of Abraham. talks about the Jewish ancestors, and then also talks about the houses of Israel and Judah in the quotation of Jeremiah 31. All of those things within the New Testament can be used in a metaphorical sense of those who are not ethnically Israel. And I'm using a lot of terminology that I recognize is not ideal, but given the time frame, I hope you will give me a little bit of leeway here. So no, the author doesn't seem to differentiate between an in-group and an out-group, and certainly doesn't identify the out-group as Jews. Another question, does the author critique Jewish religion sort of wholesale, or any of its beliefs, practices, customs? Again, this is a common assumption that comes up in Hebrew scholarship, but I think that it's the case that the author doesn't critique what the sacrificial system does, or certainly doesn't present it as a failure, but instead it presents the fact that the sacrificial system does what it was intended to do. The blood of goats and bulls, it purifies them outwardly. That's what it was expected to do. It is the case that the author will say that the blood of Christ does more, does something different, but that's not a comment on the deficiency of the first system. Another question, and this is sort of the same as the second, but from another perspective. Is there a way in which the author doesn't really talk about what they do, but instead critiques or commends who they are? Does the author seem to encourage them to identify with the Jewish people? And so from my perspective, rather than critiquing, the author commends. Consistently, the author uses language of ancestors. It talks about them, following in the footsteps of those who acted by faith, and so on and so forth. Their ancestors sometimes provide a negative example, like in Hebrews 3 and 4, but even the same people who are used as a negative example in Hebrews 3 and 4 get flipped over and become a positive example in Hebrews 11. And then finally, does the author seem to encourage or depict some sort of participation in alternative beliefs or practices? Again, my personal answer is no. And yet I have brought a test case for a passage that is often read to the contrary. So this may not be the classic Hebrews, the author of Hebrews doesn't like Jewish practices text, but it is one that seems to identify some points of contention within the community. I am talking about Hebrews 6, 1 to 6, but for now we'll focus on 6, 1 to 3. For this reason, granting the basic message to Christou, let us progress toward perfection, not doing various things, or not focusing on teaching about baptismon, skipping ahead, laying on of hands, etc. So these two phrases that I've identified are two that may or may not present some sort of tension with Jewish practices and religion. The first of these, the basic message to Christou, we've got some questions. It's certainly the case in the history of scholarship that people have presumed that this is Jesus, the Christ, but I think it's more important that we think about this as the Messiah more generally. And so then the question is, what is the basic message, the basic teaching? It could be the identity, the specific identity of the Christos. But I think that because this is a shared premise, that the author has in mind various traditions about who the Messiah will be. Let's move on from that and get to something else. Again, the something else could be the identification of Jesus specifically as the Messiah. Then with the baptismon or baptismoi, here we have washings. It is the case in the history of scholarship that many have wondered if this is a reference to the practice of baptism. The plural as well as the author's use of baptismoi in Hebrews 9, where he's almost certainly, or they are almost certainly talking about washings, ritual washings, for me suggests that this is not baptism as a single initiatory rite, but is instead a reference to an ongoing practice within Jewish religion. So with that, we have this other, and I'm realizing I need to move a little faster. So the other thing that we have is this warning. And with this, we have reference to them being enlightened, which probably has some sort of connection to a revelation from God. We have them tasting the heavenly gift, which has allusions probably to Psalm 34 and to the manna in the wilderness in various traditions that we see. And so, from my perspective, in Hebrews 6, 1-6, I don't think there's anything in this passage that is incompatible with a description of a Jewish person, their practices, their identity markers, etc. And so, with that, I just throw my considerations back up on the table. In terms of, how this changes our reading of Hebrews, I think that if the author of Hebrews is not writing to a Jewish audience or is not situating them within Jewish religion, then the strategy that this person takes is confounding. And so I'll stop there. Thank you.
Thank you, Madison, for that beautiful presentation. I really like the approach you took there about, well, what would be the non-Jewish content that would appear in this letter if we were to search for it. We will now move to the second presentation, and I am going to the website to see what that is. Yes, Amy Peeler, you are next.
Excellent. All right. Well, I really am so grateful to participate in this conversation, as was said, with old friends and new. So good to see many of you. I anticipate in our conversation to learn a great deal about the setting of this letter and about Hebrews itself. I'm reflecting that several people on this call have been so influential in my formation, and the many who are listening, new students of Hebrews maybe, might be inspired today. So I'll begin with a confession. When I first was presented the invitation and the question itself, why do you think that Hebrews should or should not be within Judaism? I have to admit I was initially confused. Is this a conversation we can have? I wondered, for does not the document, whose name came to be known as the Epistle to the Hebrews, indicate that its author locates within the texts and the practices of the people who trace their descent to Abraham and Sarah? Upon reflection, though, I recalled, of course, that the situation, whatever the situation is that led to this letter, is incredibly complicated and has been interpreted in a wide variety of ways throughout the years. So I do think the questions we're considering today are necessary and beneficial to consider seriously. So my answer to the question is this, that I do think Hebrews should be considered as within Judaism in alignment with Madison previously. And here are my reasons. Chiefly, this is the case because the author depends upon the texts considered divinely inspired and authoritative among the people of Israel, what came to be known as the canon of Jewish scriptures. The opening line, of course, refers to God as the communicative God, that God has spoken through the prophets. And henceforth, the entire letter is infused with citations, paraphrases, allusions, echoes to these texts. Moreover, in distinction from other authors of the New Testament, say for instance Paul, this author dominantly introduces these texts as the speech of God, exclusively as speech, but dominantly the speech of God, which both respects their divine origination, the divine origination of these texts, and makes them a vehicle of divine communication in the present. And I think it is worth underlining, as several on this call have done in their scholarship, that the author does not compose the speeches of God when God speaks. One could do that, right? Imagine kind of what God would say to the community. The author does not do so, but draws from Israel's scriptures to hear and pass on God's voice. Also, I would say that I am convinced that the author of Hebrews would say that the letter works along the grain of the message of these scriptures rather than stands in contradiction to them. God's gracious gifts to Israel were pointing forward to the restoration of humanity over creation as they reign in God's unshakable kingdom, living within the new covenant that Jeremiah anticipated. And then it is David's heir who will make this future a reality. This would be wide agreement, not with every Jewish person in the first century. I'm so benefited by the work of Matthew Novenson, who helps say there's a wide variety of messianisms, and yet many of them trace these scriptural themes. And I think Hebrews is one of these early Jews. Now, of course, the point of disagreement could arise between this author and other Jews of his time, and Judaism henceforth, about the identity of this Jewish king. And according to the author of Hebrews, the mediator of this new covenant, the one seated at God's right hand, is the man Jesus, born into the tribe of Judah and then crucified by Rome. But the author of Hebrews is one of the many Jews of the time who encountered the message of Jesus and his followers, and then concluded that this man and the movement around him aligned with and fulfilled the promises God had made to Israel in these texts considered sacred. So Scripture is my first answer, the author's dependence upon it. The author of Hebrews deserves to be considered within Judaism second, because of this similarity with other Jews of his time, namely locating religious thought, theological, messianic, and communal within these documents, but also deserves to be considered as within because of his ingenuity. He more so, and I am using a he here, we can have a conversation about that if we want, but it seems I'm kind of willing to go with it. Although, if it was Apollos, then Priscilla influenced him, so that's fun. All right, so he, more so than any other author whose writings survive from this time, locates Jesus's life within the cultic life of Israel. This author builds a careful argument for Jesus's priesthood and his death and resurrection as a sacrifice. And while not all readers, ancient or modern, have been convinced of his argument via the Melchizedekian priesthood and the heavenly tabernacle, he does aim to stay within the system set up in Israel's scriptures. He could have said, but he doesn't, that Jesus's ministry is an innovation of something wildly different on the part of God, but instead he reinterprets the Jesus event as in alignment with the cult. Really, is this not one of the most fascinating things that this author does? Takes the events of Jesus's life and said, oh yes, we understand those because of how we watch the priests and the sacrifices. So with respect to these things, priesthood and sacrifice, Hebrews locates Jesus within Judaism in ways that other authors do not. Hence, because of his dependence upon Israel's scriptures and the Jewish cult, Hebrews should be considered as within Judaism. Now, you might be able then to intuit my answer to the second question, but I'll go ahead and be explicit. For a text to be within Judaism, the author must display an awareness of key identity features of this people group / religion. And Hebrews qualifies, as I have said, through extensive engagement with Israel's sacred texts and the sacrificial system. But second, a text must imagine itself as working within the people group and religion, for other authors of the time may have known knowledge of Judaism, but they write documents to demean or destroy it. Hebrews, conversely, displays an aim to stay within the text and the people and the covenant with the God of the Jews. Now, others of his time may disagree and believe that his confession of Jesus as God puts him outside of the bounds, but we can consider his text to be within because I believe he would have articulated himself to be so. Finally, and maybe most weighty for me in this conversation, what changes when Hebrews is read within Judaism? I would say a great deal for readers of our own time. Now, it is helpful to locate this author historically, and so to understand that this document is part of first century Judaism. That first century Judaism includes those who confessed Jesus as the Jewish Messiah. But more importantly, I think, or at least more of an impact, When Hebrews is read within Judaism today, I believe that this aids contemporary readers and may help those readers more easily avoid a misappropriation of supersessionist readings of this document. Certainly, and Madison has already mentioned a few, some statements about the law in Hebrews sound on their own as if the author rejects the Jewish law. But this is, I believe, a misappropriation of the letter because, as I've argued, Hebrews would articulate itself as a respecter of the law, for the blessings it brought to the people of Israel and for the ways it pointed forward to the one that Hebrews believes is the Jewish Messiah. And when Hebrews is located explicitly within Judaism, then contemporary readers will not misunderstand such statements, and God forbid then use them to disparage the scriptures of Israel or Israel's sacrificial system. I should recognize, of course, that Hebrews opens the door to disparage Jewish people that do not embrace Jesus the Judahite as the eternal Messiah King. Locating Hebrews within Judaism does not eliminate that possibility, but it does ameliorate it, I think, because it shows the consistency and respect this confessor in Jesus shows toward Judaism. A certain reader may disagree with another about the identity of the Jewish Messiah, but when reading this book within its Jewish context, no reader will be tempted to disparage the Jewish faith as a whole. Given its anonymity, Hebrews has not had the same attention as other New Testament documents, and so has not been embroiled in wildly shifting ideas of its context. And given its name, its setting within Judaism has not been highly debated, although it has been discussed intensely at times. But I hope that our discussion today will create great value for all of us, because I do believe that it helps us to better understand the context, the spectrum of beliefs within first century Judaism, and then helps us to better respect the religious diversity of our own time. Thank you.
Thank you, Amy, for that presentation. We will go now to our third presenter, Eric Noffke.
Okay, thank you very much. Hi, everybody. Yes, I think that the letter to the Hebrews is part of Middle Judaism or Second Temple Judaism and represents its wide variety of expressions. So I think it's part of Middle Judaism. And these are the reasons why, or the main reasons why I think that is the case, and some will overlap with what has just been said so well and nicely presented so far. First of all, I think that there are no exegetical issues in the letter that require a recourse or a reference to pagan religion or philosophy to be explained. You can interpret the whole letter within Judaism, referring to other Jewish author or texts. And you don't have to go to pagan texts or ideas. Second, when Hebrews uses Hellenistic philosophical terminology, the impression is that this has been already digested or elaborated by centuries of reflection in the Hellenistic Jewish context. Especially Philo is a quite important reference. So I don't think that there is a direct link with Hellenistic Roman philosophies in the letter to the Hebrews, but when in some Hellenistic philosophical terminology is used, is taken from the Hellenistic Judaism elaboration of it. Third, on the contrary, as it has been just said, the Old Testament is the basis, the foundation of all theological reasoning in the letter. However, even if the author were of pagan origin, which I don't think it's the case, the intensity of his relationship with the biblical text is such that he is de facto a first century Jew. The Old Testament is so important that it's a central criterion to determine the fact that the letter is within Judaism. And also the congregation to which the letter is addressed seems to be bound by Jewish customs. There is nothing that says the contrary, and really the impression is that the people there are living more or less in a Jewish way, traditional way. Sixth, certainly the way in which the theme of the new covenant is addressed could suggest an abandonment of the Jewish matrix, a first sign of the reality of a new religion as it has been interpreted in the past. But the theme, the topic of the new covenant is absolutely biblical and never in Judaism led to the exclusion from Judaism of any group of the time, such as the Qumran community. Nobody thinks that the Qumran community is not a Jewish community because they use that idea. We are dealing then with dynamics that had already emerged during this conference and characterized the Jewish sectarianism of the period. 7, in general, the signs of novelty do not suggest an abandonment of Judaism, a break, but rather a development of premises contained in the scriptures. All the more so, since the idea of a new covenant, Hebrews 8, does not seem to exclude Torah observance, which in any case is not a topic addressed directly in the letter to the Hebrews, like it is, for instance, in the letter of Paul, nor possibly, to my view, would the exclusion of observance of traditions alone entail a break with Judaism in the broad sense. 8, the overcoming of the temple in Jerusalem, whose meaning would be summarized and brought to perfection by Jesus, also does not mean separation from Judaism. It is not denied that the temple had its importance in the past, but God's plan has now been fulfilled, rendering it obsolete. Another element that has often been seen as a sign of Jesus overcoming is high Christology. But here too, high Christology does not exclude Judaism to core. See, for instance, the academic discussion about the two thrones in heaven in Daniel 7, or the idea of the pre-existent Son of Man in the Book of Parables, the Deuteros Theos in Philo, and so on, you know, the researches of Boyarin, Segal, and others. Okay, so these are the main reasons why I think that the letter is within Judaism. One more point. The fact that the letter to the Hebrews must be entirely understood from the perspective of Middle Judaism does not automatically mean that it is fully part of it. How can we determine this aspect of the question? And I will try to answer with an example, maybe a bit funny, but it just came to my mind reading the letter. I'm a pastor of a Waldensian church, which is a Presbyterian or Reformed church, and I can confidently say that our faith is perfectly expressed in the letter to the Hebrews. The basics of our faith are there. So, can we read the Waldensian church within Judaism, within first century Judaism? Okay, so perhaps for historical reason, we would prefer to use more specifically Pauline language, but the fundamental concepts are in fact all there. Now, the question may sound funny, but to a large extent, we can say, okay, yes, in some way, the Waldensian church is within first century Judaism, because Christianity, for many aspects, is nothing more than a development of theological premises that are entirely mid-Jewish or first century Jewish. And all the issues that arose later are elaborated on the basis of Jewish documents, Middle Jewish, first century, let's say, Jewish documents. There are only 2 points, though, that, in my opinion, need to be addressed and, if possible, resolved. First point, if belonging to the ethnos, ton Judaion, is indispensable for being within Judaism, then, well, we as well then, since we are not within Judaism. And then the point is the letter, the community, the congregation of the letter within Judaism, then, do they belong to the ethnos of, to the Jewish ethnos? It seems so, but can we really simplify the issue at this point so much by linking it to the ethnicity? Is really ethnicity the point that makes or doesn't make a text Jewish? We know by now, I guess, that the answer is no. That's an important issue, but it's not, I think, one of the main reasons why we can say a text is or not within Judaism, within first century Judaism. The second point is the worship of Jesus. For today's Christians, in some way, albeit very biblically understood, it is taken for granted, some kind of worship of Jesus. But does this also apply to the letter to the Hebrews? Do they pray to Jesus? Do they pray in Jesus' name, to the name of Jesus? We don't know much about it, unfortunately. And again, did pray in Jesus is the that is defined in the first chapter, the reflection of God's glory and the exact imprint of God's very being. And he sustains all things by his powerful word. Okay, really, praying to Jesus, defined in this way, really means abandoning Judaism or not? You know, this is a big issue into the scholarship. We don't have time to go through that again. But really, these 2 points are ethnicity and in some way worshiping Jesus are an issue in the letter to the Hebrews, first. Second, are those a criterion to determine if a document is or is not Jewish? I leave it to you. Thank you very much for your attention.
Thank you, Eric, for that presentation. We now go to our fourth presenter, Jean-Claude Verrecchia.
Thank you for the invitation. And the question is, well, is Hebrews within Judaism? It comes for me as a surprise when reading the book of Zetterholm and Runeson. I discovered that there was no chapter dedicated to Hebrews, but there is at least one sentence which is interesting. I read the third part of the sentence. However, also in the case of Hebrews, scholars have argued for a more intra-Jewish perspective. I like this kind of other formulation, intra-Jewish. Well, my assumption is that clearly, yes, we should posit Hebrews within Judaism. But according to which criteria? So I will go quickly to the first criterion, exegetical reasons. I think it has been addressed already by some of you. So the Jewish fathers at the beginning, the spermatos Abraham, the descendants of Abraham, the syncresis Moses, Jesus in Hebrew 3, the refrain on the rest available in 3 and 4 based on the rebellion of the desert, Melchizedek in chapter 7, the testimony of the presbyteroi in chapter 11, even some of them were not Jews. Everything is pointing to a Jewish audience. Second, thematic reasons, the covenant theme, which has been addressed already, the covenant quote, the only extensive quote of the New Covenant in the New Testament, and the short version in Hebrews 10, but also the diatekenea in 12, the diateke ionia in 13, and mainly the temple priesthood as one of the 4 pillars of Judaism, as would have said James Dunn. So we have a massive pillar. in Hebrews 7, 8, 9, and 10, with the temple, the priesthood, and the sacrifices. So those are the first two reasons. But there is another one which has not been yet addressed. Historical reason. I am reading here a statement made by Lee Levine regarding the situation in Judea and in Jerusalem. So, between territorial disputes with pagan neighbors, tension with the Samaritans, friction vis-à-vis various Roman procurators and soldiers, and mounting internal turmoil, brigandage, messianic pretenders, socio-economic strains, urban violence, and extreme political agitators who resorted to assassination tactics. The situation deteriorated to the point where turmoil and instability had become endemic in Judea and particularly in Jerusalem. So this is the general setting. So meaning that the city of Jerusalem experienced a period of violence and instability beginning in the 50s years CE. So the event of 70 is the dramatic consequence of a deteriorating situation for nearly already 22 decades. After a period of apathy following the disaster, instability resumed, leading to the Bar Kokhba revolt. And in essence, Jerusalem has been living in blood and tears for 80 years. At the center of these tragedies, a temple, not once, but regularly defiled, then burned down with a final blow in 135. At the center of those years, a deregulation of the temple rituals, that is, a deregulation of the spiritual life of the Jews. So let me give now some examples of what I call an ongoing liturgical catastrophe. First, the Passover, the Passover riot in 49 CE. I'm reading here Josephus. On the fourth day of the feast, a certain soldier let down his breeches and exposed his privy members to the multitude, which put those that saw him into a furious rage, and made them cry out that this impious action was not done to reproach them, but God himself. Cumanus, the procurator, gave order that the whole army should take their entire armor and come to Antonia, which was a fortress which overlooked the temple. When the multitude saw the soldiers there, they were afraid at them and ran away hastily. But as the passages out were but narrow, as they thought their enemies followed them, they were crowded together in their flight, and a great number were pressed to death in those narrow passages. Nor indeed was the number fewer than 20,000 that perished in this tumult. Second example, concerning the violence of the Sicarii, there sprang up another sort of robbers in Jerusalem, which were called Sicarii, who slew men in the daytime and in the midst of the city. This they did chiefly at the festival, meaning the religious festival. Third example, the defilement of the temple. But as for John, when he could no longer plunder the people, he betook himself to sacrilege and melted down many of the sacred utensils which had been given to the temple, as also many of those vessels which were necessary for such a ministered about holy things, the cauldrons, the dishes, and the tables. John emptied the vessels of that sacred wine and oil, which the priest kept to be poured on the burnt offering, and which lay in the inner court of the temple, and distribute it among the multitude. And the final comment here of Josephus is clear. The temple was defiled everywhere with murders. So the comment of Jesus in Mark 11 that the temple was a den of robbers, well, this comment is going far above. It's something different. Then next, the massacre of the high priest. So I have a list here of 8 high priests before the beginning of the war in 66. So first one, Ananias, murdered in a temple. Ishmael, beheaded. Ananias, killed. Jesus, son of Gamaliel, killed as well. So I'm thinking here of the sentence beautifully highlighted by Gabriela Gerardini, coming from a poet, Ein lanu gadol, Kohen gadol. We don't have a high priest. And the similar sentence, or very close, from Josephus, aporia andron. Men were missing, and if you read the context of this sentence, you discover that those men missing are probably the high priest. So, if there is no high priest, what about the functioning of the temple, of the ritual? For us, this is not well. A parish can function without a clergy, but the temple without a high priest. So not only no high priest, but place defiled, ongoing violence. So Hebrews interpreters cannot ignore those circumstances. Very often, Hebrews commentators, they limit their view, saying, well, what about the date of Hebrews? Is it before 70 or after 70? This is an oversimplification. Number 4, Hebrews has a voice within the Second Temple Judaism library. So Second Temple Judaism library, significant questions are about God. Has God abandoned them? Will he intervene? How? About the temple and the city, why they have been destroyed? Should they be rebuilt? Should sacrifices still be performed? How? About the future, what next? What should they expect? Should they stay in or leave Jerusalem? Should they resist and fight? Is there any hope? So if I consider those questions, I see that Hebrew shares the same concerns as, for example, many Qumran texts, such as 11Q Temple, 4th Ezra, 2nd Baruch, 3rd Baruch, and many other texts. So to recap, for exegetical reasons, for thematic reasons, for historical reasons, for its Second Temple Judaism tone, Hebrews should be read and interpreted within a Jewish perspective. What if Hebrews is read outside a Jewish perspective? Forgetting of the survivors deprived of their possessions who had probably experienced the death of family members and friends. Remember, according to Josephus, 1,100,000 casualties. Well, I know that for Tacitus it's 600,000, but what a catastrophe. Filling the reservoir of anti-Semitism, using Hebrews as the bedrock of supersessionism, accelerating the parting of the ways, distorting its message with later Christian consideration, such as double nature of Christ, theology of atonement, substitution, universal priesthood. Hebrews within Judaism. Hebrews is a special voice within Judaism, not a parrot. As we say in England, you need to compare and to contrast. Hebrews is not interested in finding who is guilty like Josephus. Hebrews is not interested in the fate of the Roman enemy, unlike most of the apocalypses. Hebrews is not interested in any form of reconstruction, like we find in the temple scroll. Hebrews proposes a systemic reinterpretation of the Levitical system, kind of rewritten Bible. Ein lanu Kohen Gadol, response, Ekomen Arkiera. Hebrews is the time of the better. Kraton 7 times. The time of the better has come. Back to Jerusalem. The key to unlock Hebrews is not in Rome, not in the humiliating parade under the Ark of Titus once a year. The key is in Jerusalem, in the ruins of the temple, among the ashes of the city and the cry of despair of its few surviving inhabitants. Hebrews is for the city and its survivors a logos tes parakleseos, a word of encouragement. Hebrews is clearly within Judaism. Actually, is Hebrews within Christianity? Well, it took no less than 15 centuries for the Church, 1441, the Council of Florence, to accept its canonicity despite Luther and Erasmus. Thank you.
Thank you, Jean-Claude, for that presentation. We have now our next presenter, who is John Goodrich.
I want to say thanks to the conveners for inviting me to present and share my voice on this topic, which is a rather difficult one in some respects. I think probably the most difficult or challenging part of the assignment we've been giving is actually to define Judaism. We have been, I think, introduced in scholarship to a number of different definitions of Judaism, and thus to try to define whether or not Hebrews is to be placed within Judaism is going to be contingent upon how we define what Judaism is. I'm not a Jew. I'm certainly not a Second Temple Jew, and so it's going to be very challenging for me to provide a concise and compelling definition of first century Judaism. Fortunately, there are certain scholars, individuals who are better suited to answer the question than I have, but even they disagree. As is well known, Eric Gruen has argued that that Judaism is principally a religion. It consists of allegiance to Yahweh, conformity in ritual and observances, and adherence to the law is at the center of Judaism, is what Gruen argues. And then he adds in without hardly a nod to ethnicity. And so he would basically distinguish ethnicity and religion as it concerns his definition of Judaism. It would seem to me, though, that most scholars would disagree with that when they would consider, like Shai Cohen does, Judaism to be an ethno-religion. As Paula Fredrickson says, religions were ethnically embedded, ethnic groups came with cults, and it seems to me that's just about right when it comes to defining ancient Judaism. And thus, if we're going to try to figure out whether or not Hebrews is to be placed within Judaism, then we need to figure out, as an ethno-religion, what Judaism consists of. Now, we can hardly do that with any sort of in any kind of comprehensive sense, but I think we would be aided by drawing on some of the resources and analytic tools of sociologists of ethnicity. And so I would point us to sociologist John Hutchinson and Anthony Smith's definition or diagnostic features of ethnicity. They say that ethnicities comprise of 6 things: a proper name, common ancestry, historical memories, elements of shared or common culture, which oftentimes come down to religion and custom, a link to a homeland, though not necessarily its physical occupation of the homeland, and then a sense of solidarity. It seems to me those features can be easily filled out and expressed by studying ancient Judaism. There's certainly within ancient Judaism is a common sort of name, proper name, that we can attach to the Jewish people, common ancestry, which is rehearsed in the stories of the patriarchs and the Exodus in the Hebrew Bible, a common history, also expressed in the Hebrew Bible, in Second Temple Judaism, in Second Temple literature, and then a common culture expressed and defined by Torah, a common link to a homeland, which is the physical space of Israel, and then even clear expressions of in-group and out-group language, which would express solidarity. So as we then utilize these tools to see whether or not the author of Hebrews would situate himself within that definition of Judaism, I think we come to some promising results. Although we don't see the language of Jew or even Hebrew expressed in the letter to the Hebrews, we do see the language of Israel and Judah occur a couple of times, and especially in the quotation Jeremiah 31. We also see the language of the people, or the people of God, used a handful of times, which helpfully identifies the audience and the author of Hebrews with the historic people of Israel. There seems to be a common link to ancestry expressed in the book of Hebrews, especially with the use of the word fathers in the very first verse of the book, as well as language like elders, or that we see in Hebrews chapter 11. There are clear references to historical memories of the people of Israel, certainly in the wilderness generation, and then expressed numerous times in Hebrews 11. I think probably the most controversial aspects of whether or not we can define the author of Hebrews as within Judaism is going to come down to whether or not he consistently, at least, identifies with the common culture of the Jewish people. Of course, there's long-standing debate on whether or not Hebrews rejects the law and the cultic practices, but it seems to me that recent scholarship, especially the work done by David Moffat and Matthew Thiessen, has demonstrated that Hebrews does not abrogate or cancel the law in any way. In fact, the logic of the cultic system presupposes it, and so I'm encouraged by their work, and think that the evidence there would suggest that Hebrews see some significant continuity of cultic practices and expression of law and covenant with the Jewish people. The link to the homeland, the fifth criterion, is a bit tricky. I think when we look through the book of Hebrews, it would seem to me that an attachment to the physical space of Israel isn't as obvious to me, and I'd love to hear some feedback on this from my fellow panelists. But it seems to me the author pretty clearly identifies the homeland as being a kind of heavenly homeland, right? And so there isn't, seemingly to me anyway, a real close or explicit attachment to the physical space of Israel. The author and the audiences are encouraged to take on the identity of the patriarchs who were strangers and exiles, awaiting the arrival of their homeland. And then finally, is there an expression of solidarity with the ethnic group? And I would say there is, to some degree. There's solidarity with Christ, with Israel's heroes, with Christian leaders and those who suffer in the early Christ devotion group. However, there seems to me, according to Hebrews 13, at least the possibility, and I'd love again some more feedback from my co-panelists on this issue, of whether or not the author of Hebrews is at least implicitly calling for some kind of detachment from the city of Jerusalem and the occupants of Jerusalem in Hebrews 13. And so at least on the latter two criteria, it's a little less obvious to me that the author of Hebrews is identifying with the ethnicity of the Jewish people, if we're going to be utilizing Hutchinson and Smith's 6 criteria there. Having said all that, given the preponderance of evidence, I would suggest that Hebrews, on the whole, should be read within Judaism. It seems to me that on the whole, there is an identification with the ethno-religious people of Israel, and that what we have expressed in the book of Hebrews is an identification with a form of eschatological Judaism centered on Christ allegiance. And so reading Hebrews within Judaism seems to me very appropriate. What's the significance of this? I would say that at least paramount, this conclusion helpfully reminds us that reading the works of the New Testament do not effectively supersede all forms of Judaism. It does not necessitate the inference that becoming a follower of Jesus requires one to reject their Jewish identity, Jewish customs, or to leave at least wholesale the Jewish community, although one's socio-religious attachments may be relativized or reprioritized in light of their Christ allegiance. I would also like to add that even after acknowledging that the author's continued identification with Judaism seems to be expressed in the book, not all Second Temple Jews perhaps would have identified with the author of with the author of Hebrews. As John Barclay says, apostasy, like beauty, is in the eye of the beholder. And it seems like it's very possible that given the exceedingly high Christology of the book of Hebrews, that a number of the author's Jewish contemporaries may have considered the author an apostate, and so would have distanced themselves from the author. Lastly, I would simply want to comment that just because an author or a text could or should be identified within Second Temple Judaism doesn't necessarily mean that they can't also be identified with nascent Christianity, right? So I wouldn't want us to acknowledge identification with Judaism, but preclude the possibility that there's multiple identities, religious identities, that an author could take upon himself. And so whether or not we want to call that Christianity or something else is up for debate. We need to arrive at some kind of label, I would suggest, and there's certainly scholars who would reject the idea that there is anything like a Christianity that's already operative within the first century. But we need some kind of label to describe what's going on here. And so I would suggest that some kind of nascent Christianity, that kind of a label could be utilized and simultaneously embraced by somebody who identifies within Second Temple Judaism. All right, thank you.
Thank you, John. We have one more presentation before we turn to the discussants, and that is by Simon Joseph.
Thank you, Isaac and Gabriela, for the invitation. Like my colleagues today, I will also be arguing that Hebrews can be located within Judaism. And I'd like to perhaps take it one more step and to suggest that even within pre-70 CE, Second Temple Judaism. So like my colleagues, I think I agree that there are clear indications that the author self-identifies as a descendant of Abraham, and also that the audience is presumed to be within Judaism. I think my main point for today would be that if Hebrews is an expression of a non-Jewish or Christian identity, then it could be and has been read as a textual moment in the history of Christian supersessionism. But on the other hand, if the author and text are within Judaism, and even more so in pre-70 Judaism, then it may be an expression of intra-Jewish debate on sacrifice, not a Christian superseding of Judaism. I have suggested elsewhere that a critical orientation toward the sacrificial cult is plausible within a first century or Second Temple Judaism. Heavenly sacrifice in a celestial temple is an established motif within Second Temple Judaism, as is the phenomenon of Jewish groups who did not participate in the Jerusalem temple sacrificial cult. Epistle to the Hebrews, 11Q Melchizedek, and the songs of the Sabbath sacrifice all represent ritual worship of an angelic heavenly priesthood in a heavenly temple. The question then is whether this vision is compatible within a pre or post 70 CE date and location within Judaism. I take the latter theoretical possibility to be easier to digest, that of a late first century Jewish follower of Jesus, wrestling with the meaning of Jesus' death in light of the recent destruction of the temple. But I would suggest that Hebrews can not only be located within Judaism, it can also be located within pre-70 CE Judaism, Second Temple Judaism. So if the identification of Jesus' death as an atonement for sin is already present in Paul's letters long before the destruction of the temple, then we do not need to appeal to the destruction of the temple as the catalyst for sophisticated Christological visions of Jesus' atoning work. The author proposes that we have now entered a new era, and one of the signs of this era is the arrival of a superior form of sacrifice relative to the present system. With the first covenant having been made obsolete or rendered out of date or old-fashioned, with the advent of a better covenant, Jesus takes away the practice of animal sacrifice in this new era. Hebrews thus envisions the coexistence of two sacrificial systems, that of animal sacrifice and Jesus' own earthly self-sacrificing and heavenly self-offering. Hebrews develops a current philosophical and martyrological notion of self-offering, as seen in Paul's own call to Christ's followers to offer themselves as a living sacrifice, holy and acceptable to God. The Jesus of Hebrews also relates how God no longer wants sacrifices and offerings and takes no pleasure in burnt offerings and sin offerings. It does not follow that such a vision of Jesus's sacrificial significance is contingent on an inability of Jesus's followers to continue participating in the temple cult after its destruction. As is well known, Hebrews nowhere refers to the destruction of the temple. And it is difficult to understand why an author arguing that the sacrificial system is becoming obsolete would not appeal to the recent destruction of the temple to strengthen their case as demonstrably self-evident. It is also difficult to understand why that author would refer to animal sacrifices being conducted in the present tense. So could Hebrews represent a pre-70 CE vision of Jesus's celestial sacrifice that presupposes non-participation in the temple cult long before the temple's destruction in 70 CE? I think there are a number of good reasons to think so. One, we already see nascent indications of sacrificial themes in Paul's letters, written long before the destruction of the temple. Two, there were precedents within Judaism of bloodless sacrificial imaginations of celestial worship and community substitution for the temple before its destruction. Three, there is no compelling reason to think that the Jerusalem ecclesia participated in animal sacrifice prior to its destruction of the temple. The evidence is debatable and ambiguous. And according to the book of Acts, some of Jesus' first followers did continue to worship and teach in the temple, but this seems to be somewhat inconsistent, or at least in tension, with other reports, such as Stephen's vigorous criticism of the cult a short time later. Four, there were admittedly later, Jewish Christian memories of Jesus, particularly in 2nd, 3rd, and 4th century texts like the Pseudo-Clementine source material and the Gospel of the Ebionites, which point to the idea that Jesus had somehow criticized or rejected animal sacrifice, evidently as part of an intra-Christian debate over the meaning of Jesus's death, his relationship to the sacrificial cult, and perhaps toward his own people. Five, there were contemporary Jews, and here I'm thinking specifically of Philo's first century Greek-speaking Essene-like Alexandrian Therapeutai, a non-animal sacrificing community capable of interpreting Jesus's death in philosophical and celestial worship terms and images. So insofar as this thought experiment extends to envisioning Hebrews as within Judaism, and even more so within Second Temple Judaism, I would suggest that a pre-70 CE date needs to be further explored. Non-participation in the temple cult was not non-Jewish. Criticizing the administration of the cult was not non-Jewish. Competing with other Jewish groups, using innovative cultic metaphors and sacrificial motifs was not non-Jewish. The sacrificial discourse inscribed in Hebrews may be innovative and provocative, but it is compatible within a pre-70 CE date and as a Jewish author with taking place within a Jewish conversation within Judaism. Thank you.
Thank you for that. Now we can turn our attention to the discussants. We have 3 discussants lined up. We will start with Gabriella Gilardini.
Can you hear me right?
Yes, we can.
Wonderful. First of all, thank you very much to the organizers for including Hebrews into this discussion and giving the third most important theologian of the New Testament the stage in this way. I'm very grateful. And I would also like to thank all the presenters for their very, meaningful and precious insight they have given. I would like to go quickly through what sparked most thought to me as a listener. First of all, what Madison said, a little historical biographical experience. When I was working on my dissertation many years ago and was reading commentaries what I encountered very often was the question of the addressees. Are these Jews or are these Hellenists, Greeks? And it, in most cases, it was in favor of Greeks. And knowing about the anti-Semitism within New Testament scholarship, I was very suspicious whether that was still some aftermath climate, post-war climate, where the New Testament was tried to be cleaned of all the Jewish aspects of it. So I'm very glad to see where Hebrew scholarship is today. So when it comes to Madison, perhaps on your assumptions there, it could be also interesting to include the ethnicity, which some other speakers have mentioned here. This is something that I still read in present commentaries, the question whether these are Greeks or Hebrews. So this is also an assumption that is often used against Hebrews and against the view of seeing Hebrews within a Second Temple Judaism. Yes, and then Amy, thank you very much for what you said, and I agree. The quotations are very important, of course. The cult and also what you said at the end, the possibility that if we read Hebrews within Judaism, that it could be used as some sort of corrective of our own perception and interpretation of this text. I like that, but I would, in this instance, also like to remind what Amy Jill Levine said in one of her first speeches, where she said supersessionism can also happen and did happen within Judaism. It's not just that, another religion looks down and abuses Jewish texts to set down another religion, but this happens. So what does that mean? How do we have to look in a different way to supersessionism? Not just in a negative way, but as some of a debate, culture of debate within a group of people. And then Eric, I really liked what you said about the perspective of Middle Judaism, that you don't see anything within the text that cannot be interpreted within Judaism. I think that is a very strong argument. And that when there are philosophical concepts, that they are sort of digested, and you mentioned Philo, I think that is a very important observation. And then Jean-Claude, you say a lot of historical aspects, and I think that is very important, and also mentioned Josephus. And my question here is, as far as Josephus, if we read Hebrews within Second Temple Judaism, does that open new avenues to compare Hebrews with Josephus? And what would that mean if we do that? Have we done that fully, or is there more work that can be done? Question mark. And then John, you list your criteria based on ethnicity. I think, as said, ethnicity is important, but you saw some difficulties as far as the heavenly land, and asked yourself whether the author still is identifying himself or herself with Israel or Jerusalem. I recall this morning when we were talking on Luke that Feidi, I think, I hope I pronounce it right, was mentioning that there are many texts out there, Jewish texts, that speak of the heavenly land. So that does not necessarily mean that that is not Jewish per se. And last but not least, Simon, thank you very much for your input there. I think the question whether we need the destruction of the temple to locate Hebrews within Judaism is not necessary is very interesting. I think that opens up new tasks and new sets of questions to look at it. So I'm looking forward to come across these things. So I'm going through my list. Yes, on quotations. I would remind us that if we read Hebrews within Second Temple Judaism, what does that mean with rabbinical texts? I'm not saying that Hebrews is, or the rabbis quote Hebrews, or that there is a direct connection. But could that mean that we perhaps can find there motifs that we find also in Hebrews, similar as we do in Philo, that could be useful for the interpretation of our texts? And then the other that was not mentioned at all, to my surprise, is genre. That has been a huge topic. Is it a homily or is it a rhetorical piece? I don't think that has been fully exhausted and could be searched more. Are there liturgical issues or elements, and what does that mean when it is within Judaism? Yeah, that's basically it. Thank you very much.
Thank you, Gabriela. That's a nice set of questions, and I hope that after discussants have talked, the panelists will have the opportunity to respond to some of them. But we will allow our next discussant to speak, and that is Eric Mason.
Well, I would also like to share my thanks to those who organized the committee and for the invitation and for our fine presentations this morning. I regret that I've been unable to be part of the other seminars or webinars about this topic, but certainly have learned a great deal today and enjoyed what I think is going to be a very fruitful conversation. I resonate very strongly with a number of things that many of our presenters have said thus far. I would say most strongly, perhaps, with the emphasis on the rootedness of the thought and the motifs of the book of Hebrews in the Jewish scriptures and in the Jewish theological tradition. The discussions of so many of our presenters thus far, starting even with the very opening of the book, speaking of the continuity with a little bit of discontinuity, but I think the strongest note on the continuity of how God spoke in the past and now has spoken in these last days through Jesus Christ. And I think that motif that we find at the very beginning of the book of Hebrews is so important for us to keep in mind as we go throughout this text, that our author really and truly is rooting what has happened in Jesus very firmly and consistently in what our author finds in the biblical story. The motifs, and as many have pointed out, particularly the role of Jesus, his death, his sacrifice, are so often defined and presented not just in comparison to, but in the categories of the Levitical sacrificial system. Where I would depart just a little bit in terms of the understanding, though, compared to that expressed by many of our presenters today, is that I'm very open to the idea that our author of Hebrews and the audience may very well be Gentiles. Gentiles, however, if our author, for example, is a Gentile, this is a Gentile who knows the Jewish scriptures extremely well, who has been trained very intensively and effectively in Jewish interpretive methods. He knows traditional Jewish exegetical approaches. He knows common interpretations that are widely represented in other texts of Second Temple period Judaism. But is it possible that our author is a Gentile? Is it possible that our audience is a Gentile? If for no other reason, the statement in chapter 6, which was pointed to earlier, about the importance of repentance from dead works. How far can we take the dead works statement? If we find that in Paul, we tend to think that that's referring to idolatry in many cases. Can we make that same assumption for Hebrews? I'm not saying absolutely we can, but I do like to leave open the possibility. I was particularly struck in light of this by Eric's comment that, if I understood correctly, he said it kind of came to him at the last moment here, but I thought it was particularly insightful. In what sense can a modern Waldensian community be considered Jewish? If we can use that analogy to think of potential of the author and potential of the recipients of the epistle to the Hebrews, can they be seen as working in a very much a Jewish mode if their thinking is thoroughly rooted in what is very much their scripture as well, if they are a second generation or further down the road Christian community, as seems to imply, at least for our author, in the early verses of chapter 2. Their thinking is very much rooted in their biblical interpretation of the Septuagint, and particularly the Pentateuch, in terms of how they think of the significance of Jesus' own sacrifice and the heavenly sanctuary. Are we still comfortable saying that this is Hebrews within Judaism, even if the people, author, and recipients are possibly themselves Gentiles? Personally, I think yes. But with the awareness as well that I don't tend to see a conflict with other sorts of people, and I think some of our authors have pointed that out as well. We don't see the intra-group struggle here in Hebrews that maybe we see in some of the other texts under consideration in this conference, pending how one deals with chapter 13. And I think we all recognize that interpretation of the language about the altars, etc., in chapter 13 can be very tenuous. So my response would be, first, thanks to all the excellent presentations. I found something invigorating in each of them. Second, I would come down and say, yes, Hebrews within Judaism, even if the author and the recipients may not be ethnically Jewish themselves. Thank you.
Thank you, Eric. And our third and last discussant is David de Silva.
Hello, and again, thanks to the organizers and all the participants. This has been a rich hour and a half, so thank you for all that. I really just got in touch with Gabriele because I wanted to come to Rome and present on Revelation, but somehow I also got invited to this, and it's been invigorating. So I won't work through presentation by presentation. I have arrayed like 10 pages of notes that I took in the last hour and 50 minutes from all that you've been pouring out into us, which has been great. So Hebrews within Judaism, it just seems obvious to me that, of course, this author is deeply rooted in Judaism. The Jewish scriptures, the Jewish cult, everything just jumps off the page saying this is the ideological environment in which following Jesus has to make sense if it's going to make sense at all. And I would just say briefly in response to Eric and some other things that I've heard, I don't really believe that the author would be a Gentile Christ follower. But I certainly think that among the audience, we should expect to have both Jewish and Gentile Christ followers. Because if the mention of Timothy suggests anything at the end of chapter 13, it's that all of this is happening somewhere in the orbit of the Pauline mission. And one question that comes to my mind is, what does it mean also to read or listen to this sermon in the context of the Pauline mission in regards to our major question? So that the author locates himself and his grounding within Jewish scriptures and cultic practice, etc., seems to me beyond question. The question I do want to raise, and some of you have raised it, so this is now not new or brilliant anymore, unfortunately, but to what extent does the author craft a religious ideology that is capable of remaining within Judaism? I don't think he does. I think some of the ways that he pushes necessitate moving outside the camp, if I could just steal one of his phrases. Yes, he sees value in the cultic system, but how does he exploit all of that? It really is, and I'm glad Gabriela reminded us of A.J. Levine's phrase, supersession within Judaism. I find it difficult to make sense of Hebrews 7 to 10 without regarding this author saying, in the death and ascension of Jesus, we have an act that cultically supersedes what happens in the temple. This is the definitive act of mediation between human beings and the God of Israel. How do you say something like that and stay within Judaism? And we haven't, unless I had a little mini stroke, I haven't heard much about chapter 8, chapter 7 and 8, and some of the, what seems to me, the very strong things this author says that suggest while the first covenant had value, there's a first and a second covenant. And I know, yes, the Qumran community makes much of the same idea of the new covenant, but how different is the Qumran community's idea of the new covenant as doing Torah right, darn it? And this language of our author, who talks about the law having just a shadow of the good things to come and not the very essence of those things. Using words not, like first and new on 2 occasions, and daring to talk about the first covenant aging out. These don't seem to me expressions that can remain within Judaism for long. I think, and I appreciate, I can't remember who it was that talked about how would other Jews read Hebrews? Would they regard this as something within Judaism or as something that is now apostate and beyond the pale? And I think that has merit for consideration. Is there room post 70? Is there room post 135 for this author and his Jesus-centered Judaism? I think I would venture to say the answer is obviously no, there isn't room for it anymore. So have I exhausted my 3 minutes?
You're fine. If you want to say a few more comments, you can. We still have time.
Well, thank you. Thank you for...
Not too much, though.
Limited thank you. A few of the other things that I just noted. Yeah, I don't see the author pressing for alternative practices, as some of you rightly noted. But what do we do with a verse like, "We have an altar from which those who minister in the tent have no authority to eat"? Is that a hint of some, at least, sectarian ideology that says there's an us and a them within Judaism? And I'll ask also just this question, which will probably get me disinvited from future meetings, but does this author leave room for non-Jesus following Jews in his version of Judaism? I don't know the answer to that, but given how, and yes, in my commentary, I say this author is highly appreciative of the angels, of Moses, of the Levitical priests, and he does it all to bolster the value of Jesus. But does he leave room for saying, meh, Jesus, meh? All right, I'll close with that. And thanks again to all those who actually prepared for this session.
No, thank you, David. Those are poignant questions, and I'm happy you raised some comments that are somewhat, if I may phrase it this way, contrarian to a lot of the tone and content of the other panelists as I perceived it, so that we can have a nice discussion here, a good, I'll borrow from Talmud, machloket, controversy over an issue. So we can return to all of the panelists. Gabriella listed a nice list of questions for the panelists, and we have, of course, the other comments and questions from the other 2 discussants. Who would like to start?
I can jump in if that would be okay. We'll just work back through. A number of you raised the question of the audience and the author's ethnicity. I was deliberately vague in not addressing that. I think that if we take seriously the fact that the ways hadn't parted at this time, then whatever the original ethnic identity of the persons involved, they're incorporated into a Jewish community. They self-identify as Jewish going forward. And so that's why I didn't address that, and why I think it's compatible that we read Hebrews within Judaism, even if the author and audience are Gentiles, again, ethnically speaking. I do find it less likely that that's true of the author, but again, I leave that possibility open. I have way too many things to say about Hebrews 7 and 8 and 10 and all of that. I'll just say that from my perspective, the author is talking about the transformation of the law, metathesis. Judson Green, Matt Thiessen, others have really helped me to understand what that word means. In its legal context and all of that, it's not abrogation, but transformation, in which case there can be continuity in the same way that the covenant can be new or it can be renewed. And of course, that, Jeremiah 31 or, Greek Jeremiah 38, Psalm 40, or Greek Psalm 39, these are texts that are Jewish texts and that had a clear pre-Christian history. And they may represent dissatisfaction with practices at a particular time, but they don't represent or they don't obviously or necessarily represent a departure from Jewish faith. And just one more note that the growing old or near disappearance, that seems to me to really importantly point toward a future reality. It's not the case that today we can say everybody knows the Lord, as it says in Jeremiah 31. Finally, and then I'll stop, Hebrews 13:10, the altar. I don't know what to do with this text, but I think it's really important to keep in mind that it's not those serving, like the people doing the stuff, but it's actually the worshipers. We have an altar from which those worshiping in the tent don't have a right to eat. And so I think there's something more complicated here because, of course, I think it's highly unlikely that the author is saying that a Jewish person could not approach the table. I personally wonder if it has to do with the categories of sacrifice and the fact that there are various offerings from which no one could eat, including the Yom Kippur offering, because it was purgative for everyone. Those who were cleansed by the offering could not partake of it. And if Christ's offering purges or is purgation offering for all, then nobody's going to eat from it. But I can't make that case as strongly as I'd like to now. So I'll stop. Thanks very much.
Thank you for all of that. And I'm very happy Eric Mason raised the issue of authorship, because as you were saying that, it led me inevitably to Luke and questions about the ethnicity of Luke. And I was thinking of Joshua Paul Smith's work, which was mentioned in the first panel. And I never thought of the rhetorical question that I've applied to Luke. Luke is Jewish to a proven Gentile, to the author of Hebrews. But I must say, I'm really impressed by the knowledge of the letter to the Hebrews, maybe even more so than the knowledge of the author of Luke and Acts about Judaism, because he knows so well Leviticus, that book that so many of my undergraduate students dread, and maybe even we dread. It's such a remarkable knowledge of the details of the cultic system, which makes one wonder, how could an author who was not Jewish know so much about the Jewish tradition? This might be tied to the dating as well, right, which has been raised. I can see us thinking, well, there's a Justin Martyr. Justin Martyr has a very, very remarkable command of the Septuagint, but that's at a much later date when there's enough time now maybe for non-Jewish followers of Jesus to assimilate this huge amount of knowledge about Jewish tradition. But that's just my reaction. I don't want to influence too much the conversation here as a chair. We can come back to Gabriella, who has her virtual hand raised.
Just quickly to your last input, Madison, on 13:10. You can't imagine that that can happen, that Jews are not allowed to worship. When I recall correctly, the text refers to people that have fallen from God. So, within Judaism, having fallen from God, that I see many possibilities in the Hebrew Bible, in narratives where that has happened, and you no longer have access to the to whatever holy place or whatever. So I think that must not necessarily be a criterion that causes a problem.
You and we'll go to Gabriele, getting my vowels, my Italian vowel pronunciations correct here, I hope.
Yeah. You see the difference between the name written, female name and the name in Italian. Okay, Gabriella. Okay. It's more than a comment. It's also a question to all of you. I mean, because the author letter of to the Hebrews says that Jesus is worthy of more glory than Moses. So is aware of a sort of I don't want to call superiority, but a new element that has been introduced. It's very similar to also what Paul says about saying when he compares his ministry to the ministry of Moses, saying that he is doing more than the law of Moses is doing because the law of Moses is not providing forgiveness of sins. One instead, the justification in Christ is doing something that the law could not do. But at this point, the problem for me is not this sense of the new covenant is something that is doing something that the law did not do. Okay, the problem is this new covenant is replacing the old covenant totally in terms of abolishing the old covenant. And I made the case with Paul that does not seem, I mean, my case in my studies, but it doesn't seem the case in Paul. In Paul, the new covenant is added to the natural law and to the Torah of Moses, more than abolishing the gift of grace that were given before. It is true that in the letter of Hebrews, there is not only the idea of adding something that was not before, there is also the idea of a change, no? A change in the law. But I wonder if this change of the law is a general statement about the Mosaic Torah or is about the law of priesthood. So if the change in the law is a complete subversion or abolishment of the Mosaic Torah, or is limited to the order of sacrifice. So a change in the law, more than a change. Of course, there is a change because now there is another high priest. Okay. And so the old law of the priesthood has become obsolete. I don't see, honestly, evidence that this kind of statements, that of course in the history of Christianity has been presented as a foundation for supersessionism, and in reality, this wide purpose in the letter of Hebrews, because the letter of Hebrews in this context is talking more of the priesthood, okay? And we had changes in the priesthood before. I mean, it's not something new in the history of Judaism. I mean, we had the big change with the end of the Zadokite dynasty, in which the high priesthood of the sons of Zadok disappeared and was replaced, and a new law was installed where the sons of Aaron could be high priest. So I wonder if we are not taking this statement in the letter of Hebrews too broadly, how almost as if the author is addressing the entire Jewish religion of entire Mosaic Torah, or instead is talking about the priesthood and a major change in the priesthood that has occurred, in his view, because of the coming of Jesus, that is the protagonist of a new kind of covenant that addressed more directly and more specifically the problem of justification, of forgiveness of sins, in a way that the old law of the priesthood could not do. But again, depending on the kind of framework, the kind of context in which we place this statement, they may mean different things, and not necessarily a complete supersessionist approach. I don't know, David, what you think, but I would like also to not only you, also the others, I mean, but to react to this, because I don't see a complete abrogation of everything that was before. I mean, it's very specific in his view, and we had changes of the law of priesthood even before.
And if I may, just building on that as a question, even with the cultic system, and this is for the Hebrew panelists, because you spend time more than I do interacting with the work, is the Levitical system being supplanted or supplemented by the priesthood of Melchizedek? In other words, is the author just saying, look, the Levitical sacrifices, they're good, but they only offer you a bodily purification, a temporary purification. We now have this priesthood according to the order of Melchizedek, thanks to Jesus, and it's giving you a purification of the conscience, of the interior, a permanent solution to the problem. So is it more of a supplement? Or is it supplanted? That's a question I've phrased that way. But I'll let.
I wrote in the chat, what about the Melchizedek traditions in Second Enoch, where we have already a strong idea about of the priesthood, of a different kind of priesthood in the eschatological times.
Okay, so now we have several hands raised, and we'll just maybe proceed in the order that I saw them. We'll come back to Gabriella, then Simon, then Jean-Claude.
Thank you. I have several questions, but I probably should just emphasize on the one question you posed, Gabriele. Is the new just relating to a new priesthood? I wonder whether that is possible, because isn't a priesthood a consequence of a covenant and a sacrificial system? So can you just change the priesthood without also having to change the covenant? Because the covenant is the law-giving frame, and in that, so to speak, a cult institution has to be built. That's my question.
So is a modification or is a replacement?
Are you asking me?
No, I mean, if I understand correctly, my view, one thing is to say the law has been modified, okay, in some important aspects. And one different thing is to say the law is being completely rejected or abolished. So it seems to me that these are two different perspectives. In Paul, for instance, there is a strong idea of that the justification in Christ is doing something that the law, neither the natural law nor the Mosaic Torah could do. So and so Paul will also say the ministry of Jesus is greater than the ministry of Moses. Okay, but it does not abolish the previous gift of grace. This is the point also that Isaac, I think, suggested.
I would tend to modify and not replace, definitely.
Okay, let's go to Simon.
Yeah, thank you. So in conversation with previous discussants, someone raised the question of several of us have raised the question of supersessionism, and here I'd like to introduce, or at least pose for discussion, A.J. Levine's reference to supersessionism, in which she, in another location, mentions David Novak's piece on the distinction between hard and soft supersessionism. And I think that might be helpful here, because a soft supersessionism would correlate to that modification, or that that improvement upon, or perhaps even the language of better or greater or lesser, whereas that hard supersessionism, which we're all probably trying to avoid to some extent, is the replacement and abrogation that would be invoked. So I just wanted to throw that out there. I lean in the direction of the soft supersessionism here, that of course then transplants or transfers to a hard supersessionism in later interpretation. Yeah.
Hey, thanks for bringing that up. I mean, I'm on the executive board of the Society for Post-Supersessionist Theology, and maybe we should have a panel on Hebrews and supersessionism. Jean-Claude.
Yes, regarding to your comment on abrogation or something else, I do agree with Gabriela. Not, well, modification probably, and the word which is used and which is very important is kraiton. So you do not have instead of, but you have something which is kraiton, and everything is kraiton in Hebrews. The covenant, the promises, and well, everything is better. And so that I think that should be one of the keys used for the interpretation, not replacing, but improving. But in Greek, kraiton sounds very strong.
Thank you for that precision. David.
So I'm glad to see the other hands, because I really don't want to have the last word. So one thing that a number of folks have mentioned, I just want to throw some perspective on it. Everyone in this webinar, I have no doubt, wants to avoid the ills of supersessionist theology in the 21st century. I wonder to what extent we would allow a New Testament author to express a supersessionist ideology, while we ourselves simply said, and we're just not going to do that anymore. And just to be blunt, I kind of fear that our desire, our good desire, to avoid a supersessionist theology on this side of the Holocaust, to name the most obvious prompter, might be making us work very hard to avoid allowing early first century authors to say, yeah, that the death of Jesus inaugurates a new covenant, or the priestly sacrifice of Jesus accomplishes what would have been unheard of in the Levitical cult. And I'm not saying the author of Hebrews fairly represents what, if I might put it this way, the typical Jewish participant thought was happening in the Levitical cult. I'm fairly sure that the typical participant was a whole lot more optimistic about what that cult achieved than this author coming along saying it's impossible for the blood of bulls and goats to take away sins. No, I was kind of hoping that's what it was doing year after year. So let me just throw that out, and maybe, yeah, I'll just stop with that.
That's really important. And I've said this before, and I'll say it again. This is just my personal opinion. It's a complex matter. It also, I mean, to further complexify it, I think we have a disciplinary question. what I mean by discipline, theology versus religious studies, or historical analysis versus religious dialogue. I mean, if I put on my historian's hat, and I've been trained to be a historical critical investigator, if Hebrews or Paul or whatever is supersessionist, so be it. It's my duty as a historian to try to do the best, as I see it, to be as objective as possible in trying to recuperate the meaning of what these documents meant in their first century's context. Then what we do with that afterwards is another question, right? Now, that's my personal reaction to your very good point, David. It's I don't want to minimize something if it's there. Just like with other issues, it's tied to patriarchy or slavery. Are we gonna try to sugarcoat those issues? And this doesn't just concern the New Testament; it would concern virtually any ancient text. What we do with that afterwards, then, for those who have confessional commitments or others, another matter. For some of us, is to be like, well, I'm not a Christian, I'm not even Jewish, so who cares if Hebrews supersessionist? This doesn't concern me. But these are ethical questions that are very important. So we have a series of fans here. I think I see Eric, your hand is raised, and then we can come to Gabriella again or others. Amy, in fact, we'll go with Eric, Amy, and then Gabriella. There we go. Sorry, my screen is blocking some stuff.
Okay. I'm sorry, Gabriela, but I think that the text is pretty straight on the issue, because it really says that what is old is obsolete and it's gonna vanish. So I think that the new covenant replaces the old one, but at the same time, it doesn't have to be supersessionist. I mean, I fully agree with the letter to the Hebrews, because otherwise I wouldn't be a Jew of the first century, but I would be a contemporary Jew. I mean, theologically speaking, but that doesn't mean that I have to consider those who don't accept the idea of a new covenant as being damned forever in the lower part of the hell. So this is another step, I think. So I think that the letter to the Hebrews has in mind that something has radically changed, that the promises that was given through Jeremiah had occurred. But I don't think that he, in the whole letter, does the next step, saying, okay, those who don't accept, okay, everybody going to hell straight away. At least it doesn't say that straight. Okay, we were talking about those who can attend the table and so on, but I don't think that there is an excommunication, a total excommunication. I think it's more concerned about that congregation that has received the Christian gospel, and that they keep that word. It's not a general statement condemning, and there is not that much polemic against the outside. Maybe it's implied, I don't know, but I don't have the feeling that it's implied. I think that his concern is the community, is his congregation. And for the congregation, something new happened, and okay, this has consequences, and radical consequences, but doesn't have to be read as a supersessionist, especially as David was saying, being on this part of the Holocaust. I mean, we can absolutely, I guess, I hope we have learned less.
I mean, has it vanished or is it going to vanish? I mean, for me, the tense is important there. And this ties into a question that I have about eschatology. Having just recently read Matthew Novinson's very fine book on Paul and Judaism and the end of history, I'm wondering to what extent his thesis in that book has bearings for Hebrews and might tie into actually the dating of Hebrews, which I must say right now, I'm very attracted by Simon's thesis as reading this as a pre-70 text, because then the eschatology would be hidden. So the end is here, but it's not completely here. So maybe the Levitical system still has its place. It's just there's something so much greater, as Jean-Claude was
Yes.
mentioning, and what is really going to happen when the end truly comes for any Jew? What would they think about the Levitical system? I think Matthew Novison has some interesting thoughts there about Paul that might have bearings for the letter to the Hebrews. But let's go now to Amy.
Oh, this is so helpful. Eric, I just want to jump on what you were saying there. It's so beneficial when the study of this letter, when we're involved in it, to delineate the author's concerns from questions we have. This is so frequent in the warnings, right? Often people say, well, can you come back? Well, that's not what he's dealing with, right? He is really concerned with this community, So I think that's beneficial. I simply wanted to go back and express appreciation for the ways in which we are speaking of supersessionism, soft or hard, that was very helpful, or within Judaism. I wonder if we locate ourselves within different communities. It seems to me this author would say, I am remaining Jewish, right? Like I see all of this as pointing to this person that I'm claiming, but others may say, you aren't participating in the Levitical sacrifices. You're saying that something has culminated those, and so they might see him as outside. So I think this question within or without is dependent on who is answering this question, but the author would say, I'm still within. And then David De Silva, you've presented us such an important question. Can this community remain within Judaism? I see this author saying as God has revealed this one pathway of access. And again, he's not explicit about those who don't take this pathway. He wants to keep his community in. But then we have to extrapolate on that question. And it does seem that he would say, everyone is welcome, but this is the pathway of access to God's throne, through Christ, Jesus as Messiah.
Thank you for that. I'm almost forgetting now the order with all the hands raised. I think we're going to Gabriella and then Jean-Claude. Is that what I said?
Yes, I think that's what
All
you
right.
said. Thank you, Isaac. I'm also thinking about the supersessionism and the word better and so forth. What does that do if we are reminded that Philo presents his Moses godlike as a superhuman, just as our author presents Jesus? So I'm not saying that Philo knows Hebrews, but if you look just at Philo, he presents Moses just as cool and powerful and superhuman as our author presents Jesus. What does that make with our perception of being supersessionist?
Yeah, very good question. And Gabriele has provided me in the chat the list of the in which I should go for hands raised. So we're going to go next with Jean-Claude, then Madison, then Eric.
Well, just a question: is God supersessionist? Because in 8:10, he is in charge of making the progression between the old covenant and the new one. He has made the first one obsolete. So is he a supersessionist?
Good question. I'm not going to answer for God, but that's a very good question. Others, feel free. Madison, you're next.
All right. Well, talking about the question of supersessionism, I just want to mention that I find it to be the case that nobody thinks that they're a hard supersessionist. They always think that the person that's slightly stronger than they are is. And I personally would identify some of the rhetoric that we've thrown around as hard supersessionism. And that's fine, but I want us to be honest about that and not to think that's bad, so I can't be that. And that kind of comes back to what you were saying, David. A couple of things that I wanted to address that are kind of broad questions that have come up a number of times. One of them is, has the author abrogated or transformed the entire law? And I think it's important for us to recognize that the author clearly thinks that the logic of the law is still in place. He says that Jesus can't make offerings on earth because that's not according to the law. And that's just one example, but it's one of the clearest ones. But I think there are a number of different places. I mean, in some of the lesser to greater arguments, it's because this is valid, it's the bios, it's still valid. How much more valid is this? So there's not that thing that we used to think was important, it's not anymore, so let's move on. But then the last thing is, I know I'm the weirdo that thinks that it's possible that the author is still able to participate in the cult, but I think it is possible. I think what we need to keep in mind is the variety of sacrifices in the First Covenant and all of the different things that they facilitate, fellowship, thanksgiving, et cetera, et cetera. And I don't think that a number of those are incompatible with accepting the sacrifice of Christ on our behalf. Now, can they continue to make purgation offerings? I don't think so. I mean, probably not. I could see that being incompatible, but it depends on the full scope of what they think they're participating in when they approach the altar. And I mean, those of us in liturgical traditions, we know the value of these repetitive practices in devotional life. And I find it hard to believe that the author's entire way of relating to God in a physical space would just be completely upended. But also, questions about the destruction of the temple and blah, blah, blah. So thanks.
Well, thanks for that. I mean, certainly the author of Acts can imagine Paul going to the temple and offering sacrifices. And I'm thinking of Andrew Rillera's book, Lamb of the Free, not reducing the entire sacrificial system to just atonement. It serves a whole bunch of other things like Thanksgiving and so forth. Eric, I think you had your hand raised for a long time and maybe even desisted because I forgot about you. I apologize if I did that.
Oh, no, I had my hand up briefly and then felt that the argument or the flow of the discussion was shifting a bit. But since I've got the floor, I'll just make a quick comment. I just want to tag on with what Amy was saying a few moments ago about the importance of recognizing what this author's trying to do. And so I believe it was Gabriella mentioned earlier that genre hasn't been discussed very much. But if we do see this as a sermon, then we do, which I suspect many of us do, perhaps in different variations. I think it's important that we recognize that this is one text we have from this person. And, we can only know so much from one letter or one text that would, that preserved for us as a letter. We don't have multiples. We don't have anything to compare it to. We have one snapshot of what this author was saying to try to meet the immediate needs of the audience. So I think, in a sense, there a humility that there's just a lot of stuff we can't know. Not that we don't want to know it, and not that it is not reasonable and important to try to discern it. But the limitations, I think, are there, just built into the genre of what we're looking at. But then along with that, too, this person has to have something to say to encourage his distinctive community. And our author, I think, has been extremely careful and extremely eloquent in the continuity that he is expressing with the biblical tradition. But he's also got to say something different to explain why his group has a different outlook and why they should be specifically encouraged and motivated to remain faithful. So I think that's an important consideration for us to keep in mind too, as we think about the issues or the topic of supersessionism. If this is a different group, then there's got to be something different. And it doesn't necessarily have to have a barb on it, as sometimes is seen to be the case in the supersessionism conversation. So that's all.
Thanks for that. I mean, when you said we only have one letter from this author, I thought the author wrote 13 letters. That's just a joke over there, just throwing that out. John, you had your hand raised, and then we can go back to Gabriele Boccaccini.
I don't know what time we have to end, so that's why I removed my hand. But in any case, my comments are kind of from several minutes ago, and so I feel the fear of revisiting some of these older comments. But to David's comment ages ago now, it feels like about not engaging in some of these relevant texts like Hebrews 7:12 and 8:13 and all that. Yeah, I had given a hat tip to Matt Thiessen and David Moffat's work, and so I think they've done a really fine job of demonstrating that there's a continuity of at least some of the logic, the cultic logic, if not even some specific laws, right, that continue to be operative, even coinciding with the argument of Hebrews. So the issue of authorship and the ethnicity of the author, I think we need to entertain the idea that in antiquity, ethnicity is like it's constructed, right? And so I think what we see in Hebrews is a kind of form of ethnic reasoning and being projected upon the readers. And I think the author is, even if he's not like biologically descend, from people of Israel, seems to be projecting a kind of notion of ethnicity that would place him within the Jewish camp. And so even regardless of physical descent. And then Madison had raised an issue, feels like ages ago as well, about Hebrews 13:10, about worship versus service and all that. And I wanted to know more about what she was thinking, because I think the verb there is latruo, and why does that not mean like temple service? It seems like it certainly does mean that with regard to priesthood in 8:5 and some other places. So thank you.
Thank you for that. Yeah, so that's a question. I don't know if somebody will want to respond to what John raised, but in the meantime, we'll go to Gabriele.
I don't know who said so, but sometimes one of the problems for me is that sometimes when we talk about the within Judaism perspective, sometimes some people give the impression that claiming that a text or an author is Jewish means that he's no longer Christian. Okay, so and this is a big issue. I mean, so of course I know that the titles of some books that Luke is not Christian or Paul is not Christian are more the product of a publisher than exactly the goal of the author. No, but I think we should be very clear on this. I mean, claiming that a text should be read within Judaism does not mean to cancel his identity, okay? Or that he's less Christian because he's within Judaism. I mean, so I think that this is a point we should reiterate. I mean, because the fact that we are now saying that Paul or James or even Hebrews must be read within Judaism does not make this text less Christian. These are texts produced by authors that have a very strong identity. Okay, we don't want to call it Christian. I mean, let's call the way, call it the Jesus movement. But they were very much aware that they were part of a distinctive group. And the emphasis on the diversity of Second Temple Judaism allow us to make both statements, that these texts are both within Second Temple Judaism and representative of a distinctive group within Second Temple Judaism. The two things should not be considered one against the other. It's not that we are here to discuss whether Hebrews should be seen as Jewish or Christian. Okay, this is not certainly the point. My question about the extent, the latitude of the supersessionist approach to the sacrifices was also motivated by the fact that, I don't know, we could make the claim that even the rabbis replaced the sacrifices in the temple with the Torah. But nobody is talking about the rabbis no longer being within Judaism, no longer, or have abandoned. Okay, you may modify even important elements in the covenant, okay, without having, as Eric also was reminded, this negative view that everything that belongs to the old covenant is wrong, and everybody that still follows the old covenant goes to hell. Okay, so the two things are not necessary together. This is the reason why some languages of soft or hard supersessionism or modification instead of replacement are helping us not to downplay the reality of things, but to allow us to explain a process that we may not be able to describe in all its details, but certainly was gradual. So I don't think that even in our discussion of New Testament text within the alternative is simply, oh, okay, this is within Judaism, this is not, because there are also texts that are moving toward a certain direction, and they are representing a preliminary stage. And so, and as scholars, we have to find a narrative that makes sense also with nuances. Okay, of these nuances. It's not that overnight a group of Christians that until that moment were within Judaism, they woke up and they say we are no longer within Judaism. Okay, so things do not happen this way. Okay, certainly there is a process. There is a process, a gradual process that led. We know the end point because we know that led to supersessionism, to hard supersessionism, okay? But we know also that it started from Christianity being born as an apocalyptic and messianic movement within Judaism. So we know the starting point, we know the end point, and we have to find a narrative that clarifies all the stages without a sort of binary approach that either you are supersessionist or you are not, okay? Because history, the ideas do not jump this way, okay? And it took a lot of time for Christians to become hardly supersessionist.
Jean-Claude, I didn't want to dismiss your question when I said I didn't want to answer for God, but then I started to think more about what you asked. Is God a supersessionist? And the thoughts that crossed through my mind were one, just having read recently a text in the Talmud, Tractate Brachot, folio 49, side A, where it says the Torah was given to Israel with 3 covenants. Another rabbi says, no, with 13 covenants. Now, they're not really talking about, the cancelment of one covenant versus the other, but that text maybe illustrates how, well, in response to your question, the God of Israel is entitled, I suppose, to ratify a covenant, give a new covenant, right? Especially if the people break the covenant. Jeremiah says that the new covenant, in fact, in Leviticus, and I can't find the passage right now, but Sifrei Leviticus, the Tannaitic commentary on Leviticus, commenting on the verse in Leviticus where it says "Vehakimoti briti," and I will establish my covenant. It says, "I will establish my new covenant." So a new covenant will be established between the God of Israel and the Israelite people. So that's just my 2 cents, throwing that in response to your very important question about supersessionism. We have maybe 2 or 3 minutes more for some final questions or comments before we have to wrap up here. Was there anybody else, anything else that needed to be said, or somebody who wanted to say something? All right, Gabriela?
Just quickly on New Covenant. I wonder, though, whether New Covenant can also mean renewal of covenant, right? I see that in texts that sometimes New Covenant is used, but actually what is meant is renewing the covenant. So I wonder whether that also makes a difference if we lexically, look a bit closer at variations of the use of new covenant or renewal of covenant.
Question. John.
Yeah, just in response to that helpful comment, I just wonder what the implication would then be for the Mosaic covenant being called old. If it's simply the renewal, that would suggest continuity, maybe even sameness. But what is there a distinction being made between old and new?
And is the key difference? I mean, if we're comparing this with rabbinic eschatology, to use that as an example, and I'm thinking of the example for rabbinic eschatology, the Amidah, the 18 blessings, the blessings that ask for the rebuilding of the temple, the reestablishment of the throne of David here in this earth, this worldly restoration, which would maybe stand more in continuity with the idea of renewal of covenant, because the idea would be that it would look a lot more like the Mosaic covenant renewed, the system in the temple as it was practiced or is supposed to be practiced in Leviticus, versus maybe perhaps what the author of Hebrews is envisioning as like, well, we're not going to go back to that. We now have, this is about to pass away. And we have a new covenant. This new covenant, however, is something once and for all. We're not gonna go back and renew. I mean, maybe that is one of the sticking points, is how to conceive of this newness versus renewal. If we're thinking of the rabbinic imagination as such versus what might be in Hebrews. We'll take two more comments and then we have to wrap up. So Eric and then Gabriella.
I'll admit it's been a little bit since I've looked at this, but isn't it Damascus document that has the Jeremiah quotation that is commonly taken, or at least to one time was commonly taken as renewed covenant rather than a new covenant? But yet then the community that's doing this, whoever it is responsible for the Damascus document, is also kind of setting itself over against the rest of Judaism as well. So even with a renewed covenant in a Jewish context, it can still be used in a way of seeking to highlight some sort of distinction that makes the group claiming the renewed covenant to be different from others within the broader Jewish context.
Thank you for that. All right, Gabriella, final words.
I'm the one having the last word. Sorry about that. No, I think we have a good example in the Hebrew Bible. I mean, when the Sinai covenant was broken, it was renewed and it was the same. But when we come to Kadesh Barnea, it is also renewed, but it's no longer the same. The Exodus generation has no permission to enter the promised land, which is part of that covenant. So I think there are a lot of variations, and we have good examples to study variations.
Okay. Thank you to all of the participants. This has been a really stimulating discussion. A lot was going on here. I want to invite all of you to join us tomorrow for the recap session at 8:30 a.m. Eastern Standard. We can deliberate a little more about what happened in this panel and the first panel today. We have two more panels tomorrow for our third and last day, one on John within Judaism, and then other works within the New Testament. A miscellany of wide assortment of texts have been proposed for you tomorrow. You do not want to miss. But in the meantime, I wish everybody a nice day, a nice night, afternoon, morning, wherever you may be. And I hope to see you tomorrow.